this computer. Well, good morning. In some parts of the world, here we are in California, where I am, only 8 o'clock in the morning, and we've got our Russia roundtable resuming again after a number of months. I'm very delighted at the participation, people from stretching all the way from the West Coast through into the interior of Russia, and including, I would say, our speaker, of course, who is based in London. So if any would, please go on mute. See some background activity we're picking up. There we go. We've got someone speaking, or everyone else should be on mute. Okay. Well, thanks so much. Well, it's a real pleasure to have as a speaker Professor Janet Hartley, who is, well, I can't believe that she's really retired. So I know she's very, very active, but after a very long 30+ years career at the London School of Economics, is a, well, I think you'd say a prolific author. 6 books she has written herself, and I think co-written with other people, or edited 6 other books, and articles far too numerous to even. And I was very happy to meet Janet just over a month ago at a forum put on by the city of Volgograd. And I had already been reading her book on Volga, the great river in Russia, a history. So this book was published earlier this year by Yale University Press. And I think Janet can tell us whether or not it's now being translated into Russian, which I think I maybe have overheard her say. But anyway, this is a great book. I really recommend it, especially as a Christmas gift to anyone interested in Russia, or maybe even for yourself. So without further ado, I'm very happy to introduce my friend, Janet Hartley.
Thank you, Bill. That's very kind of you. I should say that I first went to Russia in 1978 when I was a postgraduate student at Leningrad University. And of course, in that time, almost many cities in the Soviet Union were closed to foreigners anyway. But beyond that, my visa was not to the Soviet Union. My visa was to Leningrad. And I had to have permission to move more than 30 kilometers out of Leningrad. So to go to Moscow, for example, I needed permission. So for me, and for many of you who've traveled to Russia, it was an enormous revelation and privilege to be able to travel outside Leningrad and Moscow, which for a long time were the only cities that I ever visited, certainly in the Soviet Union. I noticed there's somebody here from Krasnoyarsk, where I have been because my previous book was a history of Siberia. I spoke in Volgograd for 5 minutes, and I think I've got about 10 minutes, but I'm very happy to take questions beyond that. Yes, I wrote my last book, I think it probably will be my last book, was a history of the River Volga. It was entitled The Volga, A History of Russia's Greatest River. And the Volga, of course, is one of the great rivers of the world. It's the longest river in Europe. It's quite considerably longer than the Danube or the Rhine. It's not the longest river in the world. In fact, it's not the longest river in Russia, but it is the longest river in Europe. It's just over 2,200 miles. It means it's about 150 miles short of the Mississippi, but it's comparable. It's comparable with the Mississippi. In fact, if I were asked to compare it to another great river, it probably would be to the Mississippi, in part because both of them don't cross borders. They run through the heartland of the state. I know that many of you are interested in tourism, and before I started writing this book, I felt I had to see the Volga, and I took a tourist trip. The Volga runs from north to south, from just north of Moscow, west of Moscow, down to Astrakhan on the Caspian Sea. But I went south to north, slightly perversely, up the Volga, and I had to do that. I had to see the river before I wrote about it. I had to see the breadth of the river, I mean, I'm stating the obvious, but we don't have rivers like that in England or in the United Kingdom. And where we do have rivers, we have lots of bridges over them. I had to see the breadth of the river to understand the problems of communication across the river. I had to see the physical differences of the two banks. What I would call the western bank is much hillier, it's much more populous. Certainly from about Kazan south, the eastern bank is much flatter, much more arid, goes to the steppes and to the Urals. So I had to see that, had to see the dams, the hydraulic plants, just to get a sense of it. And I had to see the different people as well, as I will say in a moment. The Volga is not just a Russian river, it's also home to Tartars, to Chuvash, and I needed to see that really to appreciate it. And then, I also saw the towns, and I know towns are your particular interest. Now, the Volga, like the Mississippi, does not cross national boundaries, so it's not like the Rhine or the Danube. But nevertheless, the towns on the Volga are very distinctive. They're not at all the same. Astrakhan has a wonderful white Kremlin, but it also has a fish market where I saw fish from the Caspian that I've certainly never seen before. Volgograd, better known, of course, as Stalingrad, has this quite extraordinary set of monuments to commemorate the terrible Battle of Stalingrad, which I think still is the bloodiest single battle in world history. Saratov, I'm moving north, is a rather charming provincial town, but it also, that's a very Londoner sort of comment, it's a charming provincial town, but it was also the headquarters of the Volga Germans who were invited to come to the Volga by Catherine the Great, which is really my period, in the second half of the 18th century. Samara, the river bends round to the right at this point. It's a great haunt of pirates in the 17th and 18th century. But Samara was notable to me for its superb, really, merchant houses from the turn of the century, and just an indication, really, of the vibrancy of Russian commercial life before the revolution. We then went to Kazan, which has a quite extraordinary Kremlin. Extraordinary because the Kremlin is the physical manifestation of Russian power. It was the physical manifestation of orthodoxy and of Russian administration. And there in the middle of this Kremlin now is reputably one of the largest mosques in Europe, side by side with the Orthodox cathedral, so that tourists casually go from one to the other without realizing the sort of ideological significance of this, to me as a historian. Then to Cheboksary, which is the capital of the Chuvash People's Republic, so non-Russian, and then Nizhny Novgorod, which again is known for its Kremlin, the massive range of steps that come down to the shore. That was that visit. I've also been further north to Yaroslav, which is in the heartland of old Russia, with churches dating from the 12th century, to Tver, which has a palace, former palace, which is now an art museum, and then to the source itself. I mean, all sources are a bit disappointing. Essentially, they're a puddle in the ground. But the source of the Volga is particularly charming because it's been sacralized. There's a small chapel there, it's been blessed by the metropolitans of Moscow. So, I mean, it was a wonderful, wonderful September day when I went out there in woods in the middle of nowhere, and it was just very beautiful. So I wrote a book about the Volga in Russian history. And I think when you write a book like this, I was writing for what you might call a non-specialist educated audience. I wasn't assuming any great knowledge of Russian history, but I did try to look at it from a different perspective. And I think I learned myself that when you write the history of a river, rather than looking at Moscow and St. Petersburg, which is what we historians tend to do, you've got a very different perspective on the history of a country. So there were three main things that I looked at. The first one, the most obvious in a way, is economic and trade. Goods went up the Volga, mostly up, not down. They went up the Volga from the Caspian, spices, grain, timber, spices from the east. Goods came from the east to the west and up the Volga. Salt, very important as well in pre-modern world, up the Volga. Furs was the first thing, the Volga, and precious metals. and people followed the trade. The Vikings sailed down the Volga from the Baltic. They sailed down mainly to get coins, but also to get fur. And there were reports of them from Arab travelers, not from Russian travelers or Western travelers, but from Arab and Persian travelers in the 9th and 10th century. So trade is immensely important. People followed trade, cities were built because of trade. And even when the railways came, the trade still remained important. Railways, of course, it's easier to build a railway by the side of the river than to cross the river, but nevertheless, it was still an important waterway. In fact, it's probably least important now in a way, but it was important in the railway period as well. The importance of the Volga, if I'd had a map, which I think was on the advertisement, you'd see that it flows out to the Caspian. It doesn't flow out into the Baltic Sea or into the Black Sea. So canals had to be built in order to do that, and were from the early 18th century, from the time of Peter the Great, linking the Volga through a very complex canal system out through St. Petersburg and then out to the world. The canal system was only completed in the 20th century, in the 1930s to the 1950s, when there was a canal built to Moscow, which it was said brought the Volga to the steps of the Kremlin, and then a canal through to Rostov, where I see someone who's from Rostov on Don, not Rostov Veliki, sorry, and that then took goods out to the Black Sea. So canal building, controlling, if you like, controlling nature was part of the economic background to the Volga, and not unique to the Volga, of course. One only has to think of the Hoover Dam, the same sort of thing, the belief that you can control the river. The second thing that I looked at is what historians would particularly call sort of state building, state formation, conflict. Early states formed on the southern part of the Volga, not Russian state, non-Russians, Khazars, Bulgars, and then Mongols, who formed the Golden Horde, which became the Khanates of Kazan and Astrakhan. It's only when Ivan IV, Ivan the Terrible, conquers Kazan and Astrakhan in the middle of the 16th century that it can become seen as part of Russia, and to me as part of the Russian Empire. Many people only date the Russian Empire to the 18th century, but once Ivan has control of those territories and is the Tsar not only of Muscovy, but of Astrakhan, of Kazan, of Siberia, then if you like, it's a multi-ethnic empire. And my book really is about the Russian Empire, because I'm an empire person. I'm not a post-1917 person or a medievalist. I'm really an 18th and 19th century specialist. And I look at how it is that the Russian Empire tries to control, tries to dominate, but also has to assimilate these non-Russian, non-Christian lands into the empire. So I look at force, military force, garrisons, bureaucratic presence, Russian laws, Russian officials, Russian language. But I also look at settlers, Russian settlers, mostly serfs in the south, but also non-Russians, Catherine the Great bringing in German settlers who she believed would stimulate the economy of the Volga, and to an extent that they did. And I pay particular attention to in the book at conversions, forced conversions of, or non-forced, of either Muslim people or people with animistic belief. There are also some Buddhists in the Volga region. I think very unsuccessful attempts to convert them to orthodoxy. It's a way of seeing how the empire functioned from the bottom up. What happens when you take over a large stretch of territory, which is non-Russian, non-Christian, and impose on it or assimilate those peoples into the empire and make it run with what at the time was a very small bureaucracy and a fairly small military force as well. Empire building, state building also links with conflict. I said that Ivan the Terrible conquered Astrakhan and Kazan. It's a forcible conquest. When I was in Kazan, I was taken south to an archaeological site in Volga, and my companion was Tatar, and she pointed out the first Tatar village south of Kazan, 30 kilometers. A kilometer is about the same as a verst in Russian history, and that was what Ivan the Terrible did. He expelled the Tatars these 30 kilometers outside the city. And here we have it. It was two or 3 years ago. Everything within then, modernization, industrialization, socialism, collectivization, didn't matter. This Tatar village was still 30 kilometers from Kazan. So that sense of force, of moving people is there. In the Russian Civil War, this is sort of the what ifs of history, but what would have happened if the whites had managed to meet on the Volga. And for a short period of time, Samara was actually the capital of the socialist opposition to the Bolshevik state before it was overthrown by Kolchak. And then Stalingrad, of course, vital not only for the Soviet Union, but for the whole outcome of the Second World War. And those memorials are a testament to, I mean, an extraordinary number of men who died on both sides, and civilians as well, of course. I think on the first day, the bombing in Stalingrad killed as many civilians as the whole of the Second World War did in the bombing of London, for example, to put it into sort of comparison. So conflict on the Volga, and it was because it was the Volga, because of its strategic position, that the control couldn't be left to German hands. They never crossed the Volga, but they never controlled either the Western Bank, and that they just couldn't. I mean, that was the line that they could not cross. And then the third element that I look at is culture. And here, I mean, the Volga, like other rivers, of course, generates poetry, literature, art. Some of it, has to be said, stimulated from above. Catherine II, my ruler, had odes written to her where she tames the Volga as she goes down the Volga on a boat to see these new territories, or newish to her. She was a German, of course. The river is tamed and allows her to pass through it. So that sense of control is a cultural control as well as a physical control. As time passes, the Volga becomes a source of pride, a source of its beauty, of its power. Nothing unusual about that. It becomes personified as Mother Volga. Again, Old Man River or Father Thames, it's not unusual. It becomes sacralized, which does make it more distinctive. It becomes a holy river. And that becomes very apparent, really from the 19th century onwards, that it's a holy river which protects its people. And I think that protective element probably is unique to the Volga. It's a barrier, and that barrier must not be crossed. And I think that comes out very strongly. I mean, it comes out, of course, at the Battle of Stalingrad, but it comes out before that in terms of the way that it's projected as a barrier, something that protects Russians. Now, of course, it's not uniquely a Russian river. It's also a Tatar river. It's also a Chuvash river. But in terms of its sort of sentimental attachment, it becomes very much a sort of symbol of Russianness, if you like. And I end my book with a quote that I just picked up by chance, one of those things where browsing through the internet is valuable. It was a Russian TV program. It was in 2019, which is just before I finished the book. And it was actually talking about the low level of water in the Volga, which is one of the issues and problems that have arisen from all these hydroelectric dams. And the commentator just said at the end, without really thinking about it, she said, without the Volga, there would be no Russia. And it just came out in this TV interview, and I thought, well, yes, you know, without the Thames there wouldn't be London, but there was something more than that. It was more than just the city. It was a sense of the whole country in some ways linked with the Volga. So I'll just conclude by saying that I did go on a tourist trip up the Volga. I visited many cities of the Volga, and I just loved it. I thought it was a wonderful way to travel, to see the city and to see these places. And I hope that by writing this book, I would in some way open it up to English speakers to make them aware that there is a Russia that's beyond St. Petersburg and Moscow. And indeed, quite a few people have written to me, because it's easy enough to find my email at the LSE, and said that having read my book, they wanted to travel to the Volga, either as a tourist or sometimes to explore particular aspects of it. So I hope in my own very small way, I've managed to open up the Volga to English-speaking readers and make it clear that there is a Russia outside Moscow and St. Petersburg. And I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Well, thank you, Professor Hartley, very much. By the way, the first question I'd have, is the book being translated into Russian? Is that in the offing?
Yes, it is. I mean, it's called ECMO. It's a very large Russian publishing house, so it has been translated into Russian. But when it will come out in Russian, I don't know. It was written for an English-speaking audience. So, I mean, to me, there was something slightly odd about it then being translated into Russian. I mean, I have to explain things in the book that I wouldn't have to explain to a Russian audience, like what is a serf, but I suppose sometimes an outside view of a country is interesting. I mean, we've had that for histories of England, so I hope it's some sort of perspective anyway, even if it is a slightly outside perspective.
Well, that certainly was a very comprehensive and surprisingly so comprehensive in a brief period of time review of the book and your efforts in writing about the river and visiting the river. So again, and thank you very, very much. Let me ask any other questions which the professor has invited. You might just unmute and wave at the same time, those of you who are not in picture form. So questions for Janet? Anything? There we go, David Owens.
Hi, from Oregon. It's very interesting to me that in the old times, the rivers were like the highways and communications for countries like Russia. And I have no sense of that now. You know, we have highways and train systems. Has this changed the way people look at countries? I'm just a little fascinated by the role of rivers in times past, and is that continuing, or have we completely switched to the automobile like we have in America?
Yes, it's a very good question. My PowerPoint failed me, but one of the photos that I had was of I went to the Volga at different times of the year deliberately, and it was the Volga in March, completely snowed over. And of course, the Volga can freeze for 5 months of the year. So as a river artery for trade, it does have its limitations. I think, yes, clearly, pre the railway age, yes. I think it was always easier to transport things by river than it was by road. And that's not just Russia, it's England as well. That's why canal building was so incredibly important in the 18th century. It was important in Russia that you had to link these rivers so you could get goods out of St. Petersburg in particular, or goods to Moscow. And that was the key thing, and the canal structure allowed these goods to go out from St. Petersburg. So it was important. And then the Volga itself, of course, is part of a much larger river network, so that and sea networks, that goods can come across the Caspian, or goods can come down the Kama River and the north. So I think it is key. When does it become less important? Well, railways is the first blow, I think, in a way, to river transport, and railways are also extremely important. And of course, with the river as wide as the Volga, or something like the Mississippi, building railway bridges across the river is a difficult thing to do. So that tends to push goods going up and down the sides of the river rather than across the river, and that shifts the direction of trade. I think it does remain important for heavy goods. Timber in particular. I mean, timber has to go up the river. Oil used to, but now it's all pipelines. I don't know. I found it quite difficult, in fact, impossible, to get a simple statement about how important the Volga is to the economy of Russia today. My sense is it's less important probably than at any other time because of pipelines, of rail freight in particular, and of the road network. But that may just be my perception of seeing the Volga at particular times of year, and not seeing it when timber in particular is being shipped up the Volga. But that's my sense.
Another question from our audience. Anyone else? Oh, there's Susan.
Yes, good morning. What about the folk literature or the classical literature inspired by the Volga? I'm thinking of the Mississippi River and Mark Twain, for instance. Do you have this same? You must. Poetry, literature.
Yes, poetry in particular, but it sort of falls into two categories, if you like. There's the poetry that glorifies the river, both its beauty and seeing it as a Russian patriotic river, and that's there from the 18th century onwards. And then that by late 19th century, 20th century can get into folk songs as well. There's also the river as a form of oppression, where people strive for freedom, because in the 17th century and the 18th century, that the river was known for its really quite very violent Cossack rebellions. So there's a whole strand of both literature and popular folk songs which talk about the freedom of the Cossacks in the late 17th century and the 18th century. And that translates onwards to the late 19th century, where the river is often projected as part and parcel of the people's suffering before the revolution. And I suppose, I mean, the poet is Nekrasov, who expresses that most, but the writer is Gorky. And that's why Nizhny Novgorod is named Gorky in the Soviet period. And he writes about the river in particular in this sort of very repressive way. So there are two parallel strands. I mean, there are stories set on the Volga and plays. There's a play by Ostrovsky, there's stories by Chekhov, but there isn't one great writer, if you like, Tolstoy or Dostoevsky, who writes on the Volga. It's a combination, I think, of these two strands, of the sort of patriotic sense of the river, and also the river as epitomizing the suffering of the Russian people. And that literary depiction is also paralleled in art. So the most famous painting of the Volga is not of its beauty and its grandeur, it's the Volga boatman hauling the ship physically up the river, because of course the Volga flows the wrong way. It flows south and most goods go north, and there are many sandbanks. So it shows these men bowed down with toil, hauling the boat up the river, and one young boatman staring into the future and looking into the sort of glorious future. So I think those strands cut across all aspects of the sort of cultural depiction of the river.
And I think that's a very interesting contrast there. You mentioned about the boatmen, boat haulers, as compared to the various steamboats on the Mississippi River, which have if I can use the term loosely, romantic, or at least a wonderful cultural aspect or dimension to the riverboats going down the Mississippi and up the Mississippi, versus the hard toil of the boat haulers on the Volga. So another question, you can at least take one or two more. Anyone else stepping up?
Yes,
Gus Schrader.
and very interesting presentation. Thank you very much. I've seen you've written quite a few books about Russia and Russian history and Russian culture. What caused you to become so interested in Russia? Was it your university experience, or because it seems like you've really drilled deeply into the country?
Well, it's a great question. I wish I had a better answer. I've got absolutely no Russian ancestry at all, which is slightly unusual for a Russianist. My husband was also a Russianist, became a Russianist by the other track, if you like. He did his national service in the 1950s in the Royal Navy, and learned the language of the enemy. That's how he became a Russianist. But I have none of that background. It was at university. I was taught by somebody who was immensely distinguished scholar of Catherine the Great. And I think even then, several things struck me. One was that we didn't know that much about it. That was back in the 1970s. There's a lot more written now. But unlike French or German history, there just seemed to be lots of unknowns about how things worked, what people thought, how government functioned. And at that level, that interests me. But the other thing that really interested me, I think, was it was like us and not like us. It was Christian, but it was Orthodox. Russian is a European language. The elite spoke French. And yet there are many things that seem very alien to us as well. And I think, it's not as alien as China or Japan. It's part European, not European. European culture, not European culture. At points being closer to Europe, at other points diverging from it. And I think it was that really sparked the interest.
Thank you.
So let's have one more question. Anyway, if there is one. Anyone else?
I would like to make a comment. This is Linda Carlson. I can't get my video camera to work at the moment. I took a cruise down from St. Petersburg to Moscow a few years ago with Viking, and it was fabulous. We stopped at lots of the small villages that were mentioned in this wonderful program. Thank you so much, by the way. One thing that I noticed in the presentations we heard on the ship was that a large part of the canal section between, to connect the rivers was dug by Russian prisoners, and many lives were lost during the execution of that. And when you're floating through and seeing the enormous width of the river and the depth of it, I was just staggered by the sheer amount of human hand labor that had created that canal.
Yes, that's true of the Moscow Volga Canal. It's also true of the one in Rostov as well, which was Gulag prisoners and German prisoners of war in the 1950s, German prisoners who were not allowed home. Main canal building of the Volga out to St. Petersburg was 18th century. I don't want to pretend it was a nice life, but they weren't prisoners. I mean, they were sometimes forced labor simply because the system of serfdom meant that in effect they were forced labor. But that was slightly different, I think. But there was suffering. I mean, Bill mentioned this too with the Volga boatmen. And I think, I mean, it is one of the themes, of course, of Russian history before 1917, that the people suffered, whether it was as serfs or as sort of prisoners or as outcasts. Nobody hauled the boats up the river Volga because they thought it was a good part of their career trajectory. They did it because they couldn't do anything else. They were normally serfs who'd run away from their masters, soldiers who'd deserted, petty criminals, the desperate. I mean, nobody did it unless they were at that level. And I think that's why it becomes such an important emotive feature in Russian art and in Russian literature, that you have this wonderful great river, which is a sort of basis of Russian identity, and yet people suffered pulling the boats up, building canals.
Thank you.
Oh, very good. Well, thank you very, very much, Professor Hartley. And certainly I urge everyone to buy the book. It's a wonderful read, just unparalleled scholarship, and also very, very engaging, I might add. So
very
again,
kind. Thank you. Thanks everybody for listening.
Very good. Wonderful. All right. So let's go to number 2 on our agenda, which is reviewing some of the projects completed or perhaps in process. And therefore, let me turn first to my good friend in Volgograd, Maria, who will give us a quick rundown of, I think, at least of the forum that was held in late October.
Yes, thank you. It will be my pleasure. So, as written in the chat, my name is Maria, and I work as an international relations officer in Volgograd. And on October 30, November 1, Volgograd hosted an international forum of people's diplomacy, dialogue on the Volga, peace and mutual understanding in the 21st century. So that's kind of the name. And it united on its online platform experts from 20 countries, because holding events online kind of helps it. And all of the forum's events were organized online and broadcasted on internet platforms. And as attested by the number of views, the event of the forum attracted over 7,000 spectators from Russia, France, Italy, Great Britain, Serbia, Germany, Kazakhstan, China, Belarus, and on and on. There were panel discussions and roundtables, and the experts taking part in them were local government representatives, including those from Volgograd's sister cities. There were political experts and cultural activists, and the officers of various associations for international and intercity cooperation, including one very specific American association, which I will soon get to. I made a PowerPoint presentation, and maybe Mr. Boyron will be so kind to send it afterwards to people concerned. Because on October 30, the forum featured on its platform a series of roundtables, and one of them was dedicated to promoting domestic tourism on the Volga and the Mississippi rivers during the COVID-19 pandemic, and focused on the experience of city governments. It was co-organized by Volgograd administration, our city, the Volga Region Cities Association, and Sister Cities International. For the occasion, the executive director of our Volga Region Cities Association assumed the moderator's duties. Ms. Carol Robertson Lopez from Sister Cities International provided opening remarks. And a special mention goes to Mr. Bill Boyrum, our today's host, and the honorary chair of the CSI Board of Directors, who invited experts from all along the Mississippi River, who represented states, cities, and intercity cooperation associations. So, well, actually, I outlined the 4 states that took part in it, but it doesn't show it. And it was Mr. Boyrum, actually, who had suggested the idea of such a round table during another forum in Volgograd several years before that. So the methods of supporting domestic tourism during the COVID crisis were discussed and presented by experts from the state of Illinois and separate cities like Minneapolis from Minnesota, Clinton from Mississippi, Muscatine from Iowa, and the nonprofit organization Mississippi River Parkway Commission. From the Russian side, the reports were presented by their colleagues from along the Volga banks: Astrakhan, Kazan, Saratov, Samara, Nizhny Novgorod, Perm, and Volgograd. And a memorable event during the round table was the presentation of the book by Dr. Janet Hartley. As we were like the first in Volgograd who had the pleasure to listen about Volga, the history of the greatest Russian river. So to sum up, we would like to offer our sincerest gratitude to Sister Cities International for allowing this event to take place on such a meaningful level. And it is our hope that in future, the Volga and Mississippi cities will take part together in new initiatives aimed at the cementing of cooperation between Russia and the United States. And I thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you very much, Maria. I think the city administration and you as an integral part of the international department really has done a great deal to promote outreach and people's diplomacy and public diplomacy. So thank you very, very much. So anyone else would like to report on any projects completed or underway? Anyone can wave or step up? Anyone at this point? Oh yeah, Gus. Unmute.
Sorry. There are 2 projects underway with the city of Krasnoyarsk, not under the auspices of Sister Cities, but they might be of interest to this group. One has to do with the first Lego League. This is first robotics related, where Krasnoyarsk will be hosting the international finals for first Lego League in June of this year. And we're hoping to get the founder of First Robotics, a fellow named Dean Kamen, who invented the Segway People Mover, to participate ideally in person, but if not by video. So this is a pretty significant development where Russia is highly plugged into the first robotics competitions, which has become a way for young people to be involved in technical issues and technical development, and also international relationships. So I just wanted to let the group know that this is underway. And if anyone has any interest in this, contact me. I put my email up on the chat. Second thing is in November of next year, or this year, no, next year, obviously, Krasnoyarsk will be hosting an international, it's called ALSIB 2020 conference. And this relates to the Alaska-Siberia air route, which was created during World War II under the Lend-Lease program. And more than 8,000 aircraft were transported from the USA to Russia via this air route. And it's very significant to Krasnoyarsk. They're about to erect a monument to commemorate the ALSIB air route. And we're hoping for it to be an international conference. So again, if anyone has interest in this topic or would like to contribute to the conference in any way, let me know. That was it, Bill. Thank you.
Very good. Hey, thank you. So anyone else? I think Steve.
Also,
Thank you.
Susan has her hand up.
Who was that?
Susan
was
has her
just-
hand up.
She was just waving.
I'm sorry, that was from the.
That was a
prior-
wave, a
yeah,
flirt.
I'll put it down. Sorry.
Okay, Steve.
So there's a program called Open World that Sister Cities International has been involved with in the past. It used to be the Open World Leadership Center. Now it's called the Congressional Office of International Leadership. So it started off in 1999 as the Russian Leadership Program. And basically, it's the only exchange program that the US Congress conducts outside of the State Department. So we've hosted in Gainesville, Sister City Program of Gainesville, Inc. has hosted 23 delegations through this program. I highly recommend it for all US sister cities because it gives you an opportunity, even if the delegates are not from your sister city, it still gives you an opportunity to highlight the work of your sister city program. You can get a lot of publicity and attention while the group is in town. They're high-level groups that they send from former Soviet republics, including Russia. And also they pay a very nice stipend for your organization, around $4,000 or $5,000 you can make from hosting a group for a week. So it's a great program. And next fall, they're going to send us a delegation from our sister city of Novorossiysk, the first time. So there's this national program, but then there are, I don't know, 15 or 20 grantees, organizations such as FHI 360 and others who place these groups into local communities. So if you need help, finding out more, I'm happy to help, or you can contact them directly at the Congressional Office of International Leadership, and they'll tell you how to get hooked up so you can get a delegation to come to your town.
Thank you, Steve. Excellent. Let me ask Mary. I think Mary would like to say something.
I just, thank you, Bill. I want to echo what Steve just commented on. The Maryland Sister State Program has also taken advantage of what is now COIL since 2007, absent last year. I want to give credit to our Sister State Committee, Maryland, Leningrad Region Sister State Committee, our volunteers. They are the ones that drive this application and drive the programming. But I work with, full-time with the state government and support them. But it really is a wonderful program and fairly easy to navigate with regard to the application and reimbursements and things like that. And the Maryland Leningrad Sister State Committee does plan to host a delegation, I believe, in October related. And it's nice because you can also more or less choose different topics that you would like to host on. And so the Sister State Committee here chose something related to children and students and their well-being and welfare. So it's a pretty broad topic, but so we're excited about that since it's been a few years since we've been able to do that. So.
All right, very good. Well, thank you, Mary. And I think David has his physical hand up here.
Yes, that COIL rings a bell. That in Grants Pass, Oregon, we have the Rogue River, and in our sister city, Rubsovsk in Siberia, they have the Katun River. And 30 years ago, our cities began a relationship based on whitewater rafting. Back in 1990, they first opened Siberia to visitors, and what's now become an international wild water rafting organization was founded by these two small groups of people, where Oregonians and some Californians went rafting on the rivers. But To bring it up to date, the rafting trips are no longer live between us, but we've been very active with COIL. The Young Leadership Program operated through FHI 360 and and it's still called Open World as far as delegations. We've done them for about 6 years now, and they send 6 young leaders to your community on a theme, and they have become more active. Unfortunately, we weren't able to do our delegation, but this last year because of the pandemic, but we will this summer. But they've become more active with sister city groups, trying to encourage us to have longer term relationships. And between Grants Pass and Rubsoft, we've come up with projects, for example, for youth parks, things that we have in common. So our current project is to do a project in each city that relates to youth in parks, and things like we're both building sculptures of bears in each city, and with plaques and information, just kind of spread the idea that cities can have a long-term relationship and ongoing relationship. And I just wanted to, I guess, add that to what Steve and Mary were talking about. Thank you.
Very good. Hey, thank you very much. Good. And then I see Bill Parsons. Unmute. Yeah, there we go.
Yeah, this Open World program is something that took place in St. Petersburg, Florida this November. We had a group of 7, mostly educators from St. Petersburg, Russia, who were involved in the Sister Cities University Partnership Program sponsored by Open World. And they were here for about a week. There were a lot of contacts between the 2 universities, really more than the 2 cities, but it was part of this.
Started at 10, not 9.
Interestingly enough, they couldn't get their visas to come to the United States in Russia. They had to go to Armenia to get their visas, but there was some question whether they could even come this year, but it did work out, and it was a very, I think, successful program between the University of South Florida, which has campuses in Tampa and St. Petersburg, and the Higher School of Economics, the St. Petersburg branch, that are now paired in this Sister Cities University Partnership Program that we've talked about here before.
Very good. Yeah, well, that's again, universities really can be a catalyst. No doubt about it. Anyone else for any final question or comment there? Lowell Strombeck.
Yes, I'm the founding president of the San Diego Vladivostok Sister City program. We've been going on for about 30 years, and we have done a number of open world exchanges. I want to say that I'm delighted to see Steve Kalishman on the program. I must give him a comment of gratitude that he is the one that inspired me to find a sister city for San Diego in Russia. I attended a conference once in Colorado, and he presented a video of his sister city program. And I was so moved by it that I said, I've got to do a sister city for San Diego. Right now, we are looking at doing a photo exchange with our sister city. Vladivostok is the Navy port for Russia for the Pacific, as San Diego is the Navy port for the US on the Pacific. So we have a lot in common. But I also would like to just ask if there's a way that I could connect with Steve Kalishman, if maybe somehow I could get his email. I'd like to be able to connect with him at some point.
It's in the chat.
Oh, okay.
And I'll forward the chat. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
You can look it up.
Can I say something, Bill?
Sure, Steve.
So the conference that Lowell's referring to, and the last time I saw him was in 1986 in Boulder, Colorado. That was the first US Soviet Sister Cities Conference.
Wow.
It was fantastic. We had some great speakers. We had, the vice president of Sister Cities International back then, Tom Gittins, who has passed away, and also people from the USIA, and we actually recorded that conference, and you can see the video of it on our website. The first US Soviet Sister Cities Conference. We had a TV crew from our local TV station go out there with us in 1986, and they made a documentary about it. And the Barbara Marks Hubbard was the keynote speaker. She was fantastic. Irma Henderson from Detroit. I mean, we had a terrific group of people there. So anybody is welcome to look at that. If you go to our GNV Sister Cities website and click on the YouTube button, you can see it, or you can go to YouTube and look for the first US Soviet Sister Cities Conference. It's the history.
Steve, you've had quite an impact with people and institutions, organizations, conferences, and impact over decades. So thank you very much. Wonderful. Yeah.
Welcome.
And one final question or comment by Michael Leach and then Mary Palco. Michael.
Finding that mute button. The linkages, Veliki Novgorod contact, which began in the early 1980s, became a sister city in the 1990s, has relied heavily on the Open World program for exchanges in various issues of child and elder care. That whole social services area has led to a two-way exchange of ideas and information. It's been very fruitful, I think, both in our education programs at State University in New York at Brockport and Nazareth College, and at the University at Novgorod. We also do educator exchanges for teachers of English as a foreign language there. COVID put a stop to it, but through Zoom conferences, they've been planning a 2022 resumption. And thank you about the warning on the obtaining visas for the delegates. I'll bring that to our leaders' attention so they can work that into their conversations. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. And Mary Palco for a final comment as we draw to a close. Unmute.
Thought I was. Okay. It's not a final comment. I wanted to point out that there was still a question about the university rector's project.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
And you might want to just say that to wrap it up, but happy holidays to everyone.
Sure, right. Yeah, I think that's got to be cranked back up, kind of lost momentum, but we had approvals on both sides to do it. So it is something that we want to revive. I'm sure there's a lot of people interested in it. So look for that early in the new year. So again, thanks everyone for attending and your comments and updates on wonderful, inspiring activities. No question about it. So happy holidays to all. I think our Russian friends somehow, I think, get to celebrate 2 Christmases if they want to. Anyway.
Smart,
so,
very smart.
Thanks all very, very much. And this concludes. I'm going to post this on the Facebook page and I'll send you how to get there. So again, thanks so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.